Right, we've got apologies from Jennifer Dixon, Kay, and Paul Rue. Camilla is here somewhere. Everyone happy with the minutes of the last meeting? We'll pick up any matters arising at the end if we can, if they're not all picked up during the meeting. David, do you want to kick off with your report, please?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Slight revision to the way that this paper has been presented over the past 24 months or so, in that at the beginning of this calendar year, you asked that we adopt a convention of reporting monthly to the board on performance, in addition to a much more detailed quarterly report on performance and finance. So paragraph 1 and the annex to this report is the first of these monthly reports. This is in effect the report, it's a slightly slimmed down version of the report that we take on a monthly basis to the executive team. We will amend this so there aren't separate paragraphs and updates on recruitment and the academy, etc., as we progress. But that first report in this style is here. So I don't know whether it's worth just pausing, David, in relation to the detail in the performance report. You can see this is the February report. So it reports the progress that we're making towards the end of the year. It covers the progress that we're making in terms of registration, the updates from each of the 3 chief inspectors and directorates, update even further this report in terms of inspection activity. This is presenting the data on the performance in relation to the amount of registration activity which is taking place and the timescales within which that is being taken forward. On the inspection programme, you can see the progress that is now being made in relation to the new inspections, and as I say, the 3 directorates update much more contemporary data in terms of where we're up to towards the end of March. Enforcement activity is set out on slide 4. I think the interesting issue here is not just the quantum of enforcement activity that's taken, but the percentage of enforcement activity against all inspections is up. Historically, CQC has run at just over 4% of all enforcement activity of inspection activity, where it's currently running at just over 6%. So whilst the quantum of enforcement activity against the new regulations is down, the proportion of enforcement activity of the inspections conducted is up. Slide 5 takes us through the corporate and customer services, which is, I know the board have visited Newcastle and seen this work in operation, but this is a report of the activity that takes place in the Corporate and Customer Services Centre up in Newcastle. On slide 6, we update in relation to the number of complaints. This is complaints about CQC that we've received, and the bar charts towards the bottom of that slide also go into some broad headings about the type of content of those complaints which are coming through. And then the final slide, slide 7, is an update in relation to the current financial position. In paragraphs 2 and 3, I update on recruitment and give you the up-to-date figures in relation to this. I'm very pleased that the team in HR and recruitment, headed by Nicola Evans, that have been working on this, issued last Thursday the 300th job offer of the first tranche of recruitment activity to inspectors. That met the objective that we'd set for ourselves to get 300 by the end of April, and there are also 60 manager offers been made over that same period. So congratulations to them. They've performed exceptionally well in my view, and are to be commended for the work that they've done. The next phase is to recruit a further 300 by December, there'll be a much more focused, geographically focused recruitment activity during this next period. I think where we now sit with this is that some teams are either at their establishment, they may have people on maternity leave or sickness, but are at establishment, or maybe one below establishment. But there are other teams which are significantly below that. So this is very variable at the minute in terms of activity. So I think, Andrea, we've got more vacancies in the Somerset adult social care team. I think Mike knows and has had discussion with staff about vacancies in the hospital inspection team, in the London inspection team. So it's very uneven now, and what we need to do is target that unevenness as we go through. The Academy is a very high-level summary of the activity which is going on. The Academy is now up and running, and significant courses are being offered, both real courses, i.e. classroom-type courses that people turn up to, but also using e-learning on some basic issues around things like the duty of candour, etc., with then classroom courses on things like enforcement activity as well. ET are undertaking a number of these. I have to say I'm being put to shame by my colleagues who've done more of this than I have, but nevertheless people are actually demonstrating that they're taking this forward as well. So if I pause there, David, on the performance issues, I think that probably covers all of them.
Thanks very much. Just on the performance, the monthly report, just two things. One is there some reason why the number of enforcement actions seems to have dropped off since November? So if you look at the slide on page 4, at the bottom right-hand corner. Is that
this
Christmas? Or?
No, I think this is... Paul, do you want to help me on this? I think these are absolute numbers, not percentages, and this is the point that I was making. Yeah. So enforcement on the new methodologies, the numbers are down, the absolute numbers are down, but the proportion of enforcement activity expressed over the total amount of inspection activity as a percentage is up.
Okay, but that's over the year, I think you meant. Whereas if that was true in that month, that would be a very big difference in the number of inspections that we've done, because it looks like the number of enforcement actions has fallen from over 100 most months up to November to about 20 in February.
So we'll go back and double check all the numbers, Lewis, and if needs we can get a separate briefing to you. But I think what we're seeing is that enforcement takes a while to come through. So I expect what we'll see is that as we finish the enforcement, we'll see the numbers come up for January and February. But we will double check that to make sure that is the case.
Okay. That wouldn't entirely account for, because then they should be coming through from the previous months. That would be the.
That's true, but that's why I think we do see a ramping down from December, January, February. Each month is lower.
So,
does Rebecca, do you want to comment on this?
No, I think, as Paul said, we'd need to look into the reason behind the dip. It's right that there might be a certain sort of cyclical thing to, you know, when a tribunal case starts to when it ends, for example, it might explain it.
If I could just have a supplementary on the enforcement figures, they always make very interesting reading because of the preponderance of social care cases. How do they? It'd be useful just to know in presenting the data how they relate to the total number of ratings, because those figures appear in your report, David, but not here. So, for example, those. Where are we? The total number of enforcement actions, is that out of the 4,200 social care inspections, for example? Is the 33 enforcement actions in the hospital sector out of the total number of hospital inspections? Just to get an idea of the proportion of inspections that in the end lead to any kind of enforcement action. That's the bit that you can't quite get from that. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
So why don't we... so the challenge we've got in providing this high-level stuff is responding to the detailed questions. So why don't we bring a paper on enforcement to a board or one of the subcommittees that just unpicks this in exactly that way and really drills into that detail?
Okay, but I don't think that's a detail. Surely that is the headline figure, that of all our inspections, X% lead to an enforcement action.
Well, I think that's what that figure is in my understanding of the work that has been done, that we've now got 5.9% of all of our inspections leading to enforcement action. Maybe I'm not being clear in the way I'm expressing it. That's the comment column on the right-hand side. And that is up from what historically it's been compared to 4.6%.
So in primary care, the reason why this has happened is our proportion is going up, but the number of inspections has gone down in this period because the reports published going down because the new methodology came in October. There was a reduction in the number of inspections and the reports have taken longer to come out. If you look at the figures, and the figures you've got here are a time lag behind where we are today. If you look at the number of, for example, practices gone into who are inadequate and gone into special measures, we've got 18 inadequate practices now, and we've got a proportion of requires improvement with compliance actions, and so this is quite natural, I think, based on the throughput of inspections, throughput of inspection reports, and there be a time lag on enforcements. So next month will look different. So what you need to know is the proportion of inspections which have led to an enforcement action and the total number of inspections, and that gives you a better figure. So you're asking the right question.
Yes, by sector. No, that's right. So
is it the 5.9% broken down by sector that you're after?
Yes, yeah. But also an explanation of where, like where the 16,000 inspections were, just being clear about where they are, because that's quite a lot. I can't see where that figure's come from when you look at the other figures in your report. Anyway, the basic point is broken down by...
The 5.9% broken down by sector?
By sector with the numbers, yeah.
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 Okay. Yeah. Any other questions for David on the performance? No. Okay.
Okay, thanks. In relation to the 3 directorate updates, the figures on inspections speak for themselves. Andrea, I think, will just update you on the appointments that we've been making. Performance figures speak for themselves. I'm not going to go through those again. Andrea will update colleagues in relation to the appointments on the market oversight function. We've now appointed the director, and Andrea will update you on who that is and the other appointments.
Thank you very much. So I'm pleased to confirm the appointment of Stuart Dean as the Director of Corporate Providers and Market Oversight, and Stuart will start with us next month. He's had an extensive career in banking and the health and care sector, and most recently was the National Head of Healthcare and Pharmaceuticals at RBS. He has been involved in a number of sales refinancing processes across the sector, so has got absolutely the right experience that we need. And in his role at RBS, he was actually a member of our Market Oversight and Provider Failure Working Group, which was jointly chaired by myself and the Department of Health, which contributed to the legislative framework oversight and the development of our approach. So actually has some insight and knowledge about it as well. So that's great, and he will start with us towards the end of May. And yesterday, Sally and I, with Stuart, interviewed for the 2 heads of market oversight so that we can get some greater financial expertise into the team. And we have, subject to references, offered posts to 2 very, very strong candidates. And I think we're going to have a fantastic team. One of them hopefully will start more or less the same time as Stuart, and the other has got a bit of a longer notice period. But we are getting that team together, and we will have the people in place to do the job.
I think the update that Steve's provided again gives you the up-to-date numbers, but also of significance is a challenge to the tribunal to a decision we'd made about suspending registration of a particular practice, the tribunal upheld our decision and turned down the appeal, which I think is significant, plays, I think, to one of the points that Lewis, you've raised in the past, which is what is the impact of this enforcement activity, which I suspect is behind your question. My apologies for my mistake about missing out a figure that it's 25 out of 56 mental health trusts in that update from the Hospital Inspectorate's Hospital Inspection Directorate. Again, I think that speaks for itself. But if I pause at that point, David, I don't know whether colleagues have any questions in relation to Mike or Steve in relation to those updates as well.
Anyone got any comments? Just worth just mentioning on adult social care, we are arranging a symposium or a seminar with Care England in June, really following up Paul Corrigan's issue about the viability of local authority funded domiciliary and residential adult social care. And that'll take place in June. I don't think we've got a date yet for it, but as soon as we have, we'll let you know when that's going to take place. That's with ourselves and the major providers of adult social care. Mike, did you want to add anything on? I know you had a good run through on hospitals at the meeting yesterday evening.
We had a detailed run through yesterday evening. No, I think in terms of the last month, obviously the most notable thing is that we have got our second hospital that has been declared outstanding in Salford Royal, and that was really very good news. I think otherwise it's as it is.
Okay. Camilla, then.
Just to ask you, in relation to the piece in the Times this morning, obviously Circle are now saying that they made, I think they said, minimal changes between our two inspections. That was very much not what we had understood and what I think our inspectors had felt. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
Two comments. First of all, that does not in any way correspond with the length of their action plan that they submitted to us, and which we have stored. I haven't been able to go through it all this morning since seeing that headline, but it's a very lengthy action plan that they submitted to us. It doesn't correspond at all to what we've been told. And the headline saying that we have backed down is entirely wrong as well. We have not backed down. What happened was that in September, as you know, we found the hospital to be inadequate, and in particular in medicine, surgery and A&E. We went back in January and it was better. But then a whole lot of the things that had changed, we would expect to be able to be changed within that time period, and that is precisely why we declare something to be inadequate and expect urgent action.
You mentioned the meeting last night that some of us were able to get to, at least for part of the time. It was a very good meeting. I have one reservation about it, as I mentioned to Michael, which is that it might mean that some issues that should be aired publicly might not then come to the board, and you can sense that now because we talked about it last night. And I just wondered whether we should, whether it's for the item later, where this meeting is on the agenda, or whether we should just be clear about some of the key points that came out of yesterday's meeting, Mike, which I think, some of them were really quite important. The distribution of overall ratings with requires improvement being the main rating that hospitals get. The fact that the safety ratings are the main reason why they don't get, the safety domain is the main reason why they don't end up with a higher rating. The caring domain is becoming difficult to interpret because almost everybody does well on it. And then the more general cross-sector point, which is that this distribution is different between social care, primary care, and the hospital sector. Now, that may reflect real differences, or it may be something about the inspection methodology and how it's being conducted, the standards we're setting. So, for example, primary care is doing significantly better than the other two sectors. Well, I'm just wondering whether we are. But
I thought what we should do, you having gone through the report that Mike prepared, and I don't know whether you're going to change the report in light of the discussions you had, that report should then come to the public board meeting, probably at the next meeting, I would have thought, for a full discussion, so that the paper is in the public domain as well. Do you feel that's right? I mean, it struck me that everything in that paper ought to be in the public. There's no reason why it shouldn't be public.
I mean, clearly, everything in the paper should be in the public domain, other than those things which are still going through the process and which have not yet been published. And we talked about a couple of reports that are not yet published. So, but those will come into the public domain in due course. But we'd be very happy to provide a paper setting out not only what we discussed, but what the comments that came back from board members.
I thought it was a very good paper, and I thought I couldn't see anything that should be kept private. Michael, do you agree with that?
Yes, I think it was an excellent paper, and I think we had a very good discussion. And the one paragraph that Martin has written up doesn't really do justice to our meeting yesterday, and Lewis's point about safety, for example, I think that all of the colleagues who were there yesterday were, I'm not sure, shocked. Well, maybe shocked is the right term, actually, that over 50% of all hospitals that have been inspected have been rated as on safety, as required improvement. And Ted Baker made the point that hospitals in the UK are far less safe than we thought they were, or indeed that the hospitals think they are. So that was a very important issue. The only other issue I'd add to the ones Lewis mentioned is this timing issue. And Mike had, it's clear the hospital directorate realises that timing is a problem. Timing of the publication of the reports, or the time between the inspection and the unannounced follow-up inspection and the publication of the report. We didn't actually have enough time, I think, to really discuss this yesterday. But if we had, I think I would have raised with Mike whether it might be possible to have and I'm just going to use this for the sake of example, could we publish a 10-page report much earlier, and the more detailed, 80 or 90-page, very thorough report, whatever it is, 5 or 6 weeks after that? Because I think that Hinchinbrook is, very interesting because, of course, the headline should have been, as a result of the CQC's inspection, this hospital has improved very significantly over the 4 months since the inspection, or whatever. That should have been our headline. And I just wonder whether it would, whether there is a form of report which could be published much earlier. That's the only other point I'd add. And as I say, there's absolutely no doubt that Mike recognises this as an issue. The question is quite how to deal with it.
I think there are a number of steps that we are already taking. We give immediate feedback to the trust at the end of the inspection itself, so that they are aware of our main concerns and they can start taking action immediately. We have, in a number of cases, and Hinchinbrook was one, where we have serious concerns, we have written to the trust within the first week or two after the inspection to make sure that we sort of reinforce any messages that we've given at the end of the inspection. We haven't historically made those letters public, although the letter about Hinchinbrook got into the public domain. That was not through us, but it did. Now, we can decide whether those should all be public or not. That's a different discussion that we could come back to. The other thing is that we, going back to the enforcement point, we now hold a management review meeting very shortly after each of our comprehensive inspections, within a couple of days, where we review should there be any enforcement action that we should be taking, so that we don't wait for the full report to be available. And if a warning notice has to be issued, we will issue the warning notice straight away. So I think those are all minor but important modifications to our process that we have taken over the last 6 to 9 months to make sure that action is taken as soon as possible to get improvements being made.
It seems to me there are two competing interests here. One is the public interest, genuine public interest in knowing what it is that's been found and what's being done about it, which tends to militate putting things into a public domain as soon as possible. The conflicting interest is in ensuring that what is put in the public domain is accurate and fair. And getting the balance of that right is not always easy, because the worst thing is to put information into the public domain which is wrong for whatever reason or is retracted, which is emphatically, it seems to me, not the case in Hinchingbrook from what we've been told. And the danger of putting summary reports quickly into the public domain, particularly if they're adverse, is that someone finds something that's wrong with them and that needs to be changed, and that's not good either for the organisation, the provider, or for us, or the public. So there does have to be a balance. But I do think that where a report such as Hinchingbrook, and there may be others, are published, there may be a way, I wonder if there's a way in which there can be a narrative that is continuing about what action is being taken about an adverse report. So that, for instance, Mike mentions an action plan. Should that, as a matter of course, be published so that the public know what it is the Trust is doing in response to the report, that sort of fills a bit of a gap, and then we go and re-inspect and find out what's going on, but the gap isn't quite as sort of stark as it currently is. But that's just an idea.
Can I suggest, Mike, that we have the paper to the board, and reflecting the discussions you had at the meeting last night, and particularly this timing issue is critical, I think. I mean, a lot of the feedback from trusts is it's taken too long to get the report out, and we're aware of that. And I know how complex these hospitals are.
One of the slides that we did look at briefly yesterday was the timeline from inspection to report, and I'd be happy to put that into the paper, because actually it shows the number of steps. It's coming back to Robert's point that we have to be fair, we have to give them time for factual accuracy checks, we have then to take them on board, and it is a complex process. And as one of my deputies has pointed out, a lot of these reports are the length of a PhD thesis, and to write that and to write it accurately and well in, let's say, 50 working days is actually quite a quick turnaround. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't take the action earlier on, which is what we are what we're doing.
Or that we need something as long as a PhD thesis.
Well,
in a sense.
yes, but then if we don't do that, we're not saying why we can give the headlines, we thought this was terrible or we thought it was wonderful, but actually it's more useful if we say why we thought it was terrible or wonderful.
A very perhaps and slightly naughty point, which is that even in the most complicated of cases, judges often manage to produce a judgment of less than 30 pages and explains in entirety the reasons, the issues, and the underlying evidence. Not always, of course, but it is possible.
And we do, of course, and one of the things we've introduced is having a Chief Inspector of Hospitals letter at the beginning of the report, which tends to be just a few pages, typically 4 or 5 pages, which we hope will actually summarise the whole of a very complex trust, which may have a £600 million turnover.
Okay, the reason we publish the reports is to encourage improvement so that services get better. Each report looks at least 8 core services. If we don't have the detail about every one of those, from maternity, paediatrics through to end-of-life care, then we're not doing our job well in encouraging improvement and explaining what's already good about the trust and what could be better and what people could learn.
Okay, well, Mike, if we can have that report back at the next meeting with reflecting the discussion you had at your meeting yesterday evening, and that would be great. Thanks very much. Did Steve or Andrea want to say anything about your social care? Oh, no need to if you don't want to. No? Okay.
So the rest of the report is just updates. I'll not dwell on them at all, David. So Bill Kirkup completed his investigation into Morecambe Bay, and we've invited, and he's kindly accepted coming to speak both to this board, but also he'll then do a seminar for staff, which will webinar and then capture it and place it on our database so that staff can use that in the fullness of time. Really what we want him to do is actually go through the learning that came out of his investigation and actually share that with us and pick out what the implications are for us. So, it will give you as a board the opportunity to have a conversation with him. Of all the private members' bills that were actually floating around in the end of the last parliamentary session, the one by Jeremy Lefroy, the MP for Stafford, that one succeeded, and I've just in paragraph 8 captured, in effect, the Act that was passed on safety and quality. So we've got the wording from that and the implications for that in relation to that particular piece of legislation. The significance of this is that it was about the safety of treatment and giving us further responsibilities in relation to ensuring that people are receiving care which is safe. And the debate in Parliament was about avoidable harm and no harm, zero harm in effect. The legislative process is now settled, and it's a requirement about preventing avoidable harm and risk of harm. So that now passes into the legislation. The other thing I just wanted to draw attention to is something that came out, I think, either on the last day, the penultimate day of the parliamentary session, which was a report from the Public Administration Select Committee on their inquiry into complaints and investigating clinical incidents. I do think this is a significant report. I think it's filleted a number of issues, particularly about investigations, and a paper by two academics, McRae and Vincent. These academics did some work with us on safety, interestingly enough, given the point that was being made yesterday evening around safety, and that academic position did inform the position that we've taken on safety. But essentially what McRae and Vincent's paper said is that any investigation into clinical incidents needs to be separate from either the regulatory process, the management process and the criminal process. And I have to say personally, the more I've thought and reflected on that paper, the more I think they've landed in a good place, and that there's a currency in this that needs to be pursued. Because of where it landed in the parliamentary process, there's no sense of what the next steps are from a government. It'll be for the next government to decide what they need to do in relation to taking this forward. But it does play to some of the conversations we've had here about the safety function across health and care, where that should be located, how it should be taken forward, etc. So I suspect this is an issue that we are going to return to in the spring and into the summer. But it is a significant report that I think makes some very, very sensible suggestions about some developments that need to take place. And then the last paragraph, David, is just flagging a report which, because of PERDA, there was a decision taken not to publish it. But I notice Health Service Journal have carried 1 or 2 news items on this, so some of the information in this is creeping into the public domain about what the Smith review. Smith is the Deputy Chairman of NHS England, who carried out a review of improvement capability and of the leadership in leadership development programmes. That report has now concluded. It will be published after the election. There is a commitment to do that, but they're just in this slightly awkward space of not publishing at the minute. I think it is consistent with some of the work that we published on Shaping the Future and in our business plan, and anticipates some of those changes and sees an empowering of academic science networks as a way of actually taking forward improvements at a local level. Again, a significant issue. I just wanted to flag this is about because it is in the public domain already. But I don't think there's a huge amount in that. It's more an anticipation of things to come rather than a report on progress. Thanks.
Just 2 points. Firstly, in relation to the Public Administration Select Committee, can I just endorse everything David has just said, it seems to me it plays not only to the priority that needs to be given to safety in a way that hasn't been before, but it also potentially provides a means of dealing with the problems this organisation and indeed others continually have with seeking to satisfy the concerns of individuals who's either have personally suffered but most tragically have lost a loved one to an apparently avoidable harm, and they find there's nowhere that provides a satisfactory answer to the many questions they have. And I do believe that this report potentially provides the solution. The other was more of a question in relation to the second item, which, as David points out, is about leadership. Can I ask whether it is known whether the review conducted by Lord Rose, which was on leadership in the NHS, and therefore I would have thought was relevant in this space, is intended to be published?
Thank you, Robert. I nearly did introduce the Lord Rose report. My understanding is that it is the government's intention to publish the Lord Rose report. I think that was the commitment that the government made. I guess this is one of those things that sits right on the cusp of who will form the next government and will that commitment remain. But my understanding is the intention is to actually publish that report. Yeah.
Just a quick question on the Public Administration Select Committee. Very much support what Robert said, and I just wonder to what extent you think this would fill the gap that we've identified before about investigating individual complaints. I mean, are they setting the bar very high when they say the most serious clinical incidents? Or is it sort of not, are they not that specific? And if the bar is set very high, should we perhaps be pushing for the bar to be set a bit lower?
So I think they start one step back from that, and I think they start by saying, in other industries where safety is at a premium, there is a separate arrangement to investigate serious incidents. And the comparisons they make is with aviation and rail. And in both aviation and rail, there are accident investigation branches which have the capacity and capability to actually undertake quite forensic investigations of what happened and why it happened. And the purpose of that is for learning. And it's not cluttered or confused or overlaid by any regulatory responsibilities or criminal responsibilities. So that function is seen as critical to shaping a culture of openness in reporting about what went wrong, so that people aren't fearing any repercussions, either regulatory or criminal, in the analysis that's undertaken. And I think that's a compelling bit of the argument for me about how that should take place. I think some would observe that there's not been a public inquiry in aviation since the 70s. So there is a sense that function is seen as more than capable and has not felt the need to push in public inquiries into that space, because people have got confidence that it does the job that's required and you don't need government to set up separate investigations. And if you think of the history of health, and Robert sitting here is a vivid reminder of the number of people that over the years have been invited to conduct an inquiry and investigation, which costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time, in a way that this is a neater, lighter, more nimble and agile way of actually extracting the learning, but is one that people have trust and confidence in. So there is, I think, that's why I think this is a compelling report and a very interesting one to consider. In terms of your question, I think that what sits at the behind some of this, and I think Robert's report has created a debate about this as well over the past couple of years, is whether there is a view that on some of the responsibilities that organisations, health trusts currently have on things like Lewis homicide inquiries or other investigations where there's been serious incidents. This is the significance of the Lefroy clauses, I think. There is a sense that this is not done properly, it's not done rigorously enough, and it's not done in a way that always gives people confidence. I think our view will be we see great rigour in some places and less than great rigour in other places, quite frankly. It's virtually silent in relation to primary medical services, and I don't think there's a great tradition in adult social care anyway in relation to this. So I think the second bit that's being pulled out here is about the competency of the people undertaking it. It's not that they're incompetent, but there is a skill to carrying out investigations to extract the learning, which is something that the air accident and rail accident people have developed. I think the Health and Safety Laboratory up in Derbyshire have developed some of these skills as well. So I think the other space they're pushing into is how do you get these investigations carried forward with the right degree of investigative skill and competence so that people can have confidence in the findings. And that's the other thing I think that's being flagged here. So things like in air accidents, I am told by people that something like 70% of air accidents are due to human factors. This is a Martin Bromley point. And I think there is a view that many accidents and issues in health and care probably have a similar proportion of human factors. But the degree of knowledge around human factors and how that features in investigations alongside the scientists who look at stresses and tolerances in metals and those other things, it's that understanding of human factors which I think there is a view that is lacking. People like James Titcombe, who work with us now, they've given evidence to the Public Administration Select Committee on these issues. I think others have made this point about human factors. So I think that's the skill that needs to be developed. We are offering through the Academy human factors training to a number of our inspectors and are offering that as an addition to our core curriculum, and we'll continue to do that. But I think they're the issues. So I think that's why I think it's significant. I mean, you'll have an even sharper view than mine, Robert, but it's why I think it's significant, Camilla, and why I think what happens next is quite critical, because I think this is a gap. I don't think there's been a very big debate about significance. I think what we've done is, post-Roberts report, is socialise into the language on the duty of candour and other things what we mean by harm. And I think the definitions that have been set, really, are serious and moderate harm. And that has a particular definition and meaning in health because it's about the referral to NRLS. So it should cover the majority, and I think it does fill a gap that we don't fill, which is about individuals who don't feel they've got satisfaction in what has happened, having a recourse to that. But the emphasis is on that is done locally. I don't think the Air Accident Investigation Branch investigate absolutely everything that goes wrong in the same way that I think if there's a national unit created, they could do everything. The interesting issue is on civil aviation and rail, the body that hosts those investigation branches is national government. You could argue that's the case because I don't think there's any public money in air travel. There's 120 billion in health and care, so I think how you get the degree of independence from those that are providing the service is going to be an issue that will need to be talked through, and I don't think those issues were raised. I think this was much more about what is the function of investigations and is it appropriately developed in relation to health and care. I think it is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a lot of work on human factors, and the relationship, what health can learn from aviation is, we all know. I mean, it's very clear. All I wanted to say was, I think, can we try and make sure this doesn't get lost in the next Parliament? Because it seems to me it is something that, from what you've said, I mean, is really positive, and if we can help to develop it, we should.
Get lost, it's too important.
Thanks. I think we need to be slightly careful with this particular recommendation, only in the sense that perhaps one of the most significant things about the PASC report is that what it identifies are quite significant issues with three very closely related but different things. The first is the one that you've talked to, David, which is about the investigation of serious incidents, which is clearly a gap, and but which is about the investigation of serious incidents with fundamentally the public interest of improvement of safety in the system at its heart, not about the private interest of getting resolution or satisfaction for in relation to what has happened, except that what has happened has resulted in a better understanding of how it could not happen again. So it kind of gets that sense of improvement, but it doesn't focus on individual resolution. And what the report also covers, though, which I think we should not underestimate, and of course other reports have also covered, and work that Health Watch England have done and various other organisations have done, have pointed to, is that there are very significant issues, both with the way that complaints are addressed through the system, where it's quite appropriate that the system, sort of the point in the system closest to the complainant, should deal with things in a better way, so that people get quicker kind of first-time response to their issue, which raises all the cultural questions that we know about the defensiveness, the difficulty people within health and social care seem to have in admitting that something went wrong and telling people what it was, very close to the point at which it happened. And then secondarily, and also really importantly, the Ombudsman system. So this report makes some really strong recommendations in relation to the Ombudsman system, which of course is where if these things are not dealt with locally, they get dealt with at a national level. And there's another report, name of which completely escapes me, too many reports, which was published just before Purdah, which looks at the Ombudsman systems across health and social care, and recommends the bringing together of the PHSO with the LGO in order to, as well as reform of the PHSO, which is in the PASC report. So I think what you're seeing is a kind of a groundswell of evidence and opinion, which says that actually all three of these elements are either not there or a bit broken and need to be improved significantly. And I think the important thing for us is to make sure that we keep our eye on all three, because they will be hugely important to us feeling that this question you referenced, Camilla, that individuals, we don't have a way to be confident that individuals get what they need, as well as we don't have a way of being confident that the system gets what it needs. But we need to think about all three elements, not just one. Otherwise, we'll kind of over-focus.
Just taking Anna's point, at the heart of any resolution of any complaint or grievance by an individual, but also at the heart of any systems consideration by a body like ourselves, is actually an understanding about what happened and why it happened. And until you have that absolutely firm foundation of an authoritative finding that all are going to accept because it's been done properly, then the work of either a complaint service or a systems regulator, or indeed a professional regulator, is much more difficult to do in a satisfying way. So I do believe that this is at the heart of that, and it's also at the heart of the recognition that so much of what goes wrong, which currently gets blamed on some hapless nurse or a midwife or a consultant, or dare I say it, even a manager, is often down to a faulty system that needs fixing, so that people are not put in the situations in which they are. And if that is done, then a huge number of complaints are easy, or concerns around how a place is run are easy to resolve. And so I would urge that this organisation does play its part in ensuring that the recommendations in this report in that regard are pursued, because it is a high-level report of necessity, and there's a lot of detailed work that would be required to be done.
Well, briefly, because I was going to say more or less what Anna said, actually. I think that's absolutely right. And my concern about this is that the different elements of the system that you're referring to actually will not just we have to keep an eye on all of them, but that they will act in conflict with each other. That's my biggest concern. So that the Area Accident Investigation Branch presumably doesn't deal with all that many incidents, I'm assuming. Yeah, exactly. So somewhere along the line, it's absolutely right. We're going to have to draw a line and say below this line, those incidents are not suitable for any investigative process that might be set up. Realistically, that has got to happen. So if you take mental health alone, there are 1,300 patient suicides every year under mental health care. Now, you cannot possibly have a system which acts to investigate all of them individually. And that's just one bit of the system, one particular sort of outcome. And the problem is that the other major failing in the current system is the way that families feel that they are lost in a system which cannot move because another bit of the system hasn't moved yet. So I quite often hear from people who, because there hasn't been an inquest, there hasn't been a local complaints investigation, or maybe there has and it hasn't reported yet. That means that the system is then paralysed, so the NHS England won't act because of a complaints process which is in train. The Ombudsman sometimes has a reason because of some other organisational delay for not taking action, and so on. And people become incredibly distressed and eventually exhausted by that experience. Now, the trouble is that people who have that experience, who we have to have in mind, are not necessarily the people who have experienced the most serious incidents. And so there will be a conflict between trying to help those people and at the same time setting a threshold. They just cannot possibly be the same cases by definition. And the reason that this obviously matters to our general work, but it matters to us specifically because we are part of that system. And the letters I get from people also say how CQC will not take action because other people are involved or they haven't yet completed their work. And this is going to be a big issue. It's absolutely right. We must make sure it doesn't get lost, but also we must get this balance and this conflict right, because it will reflect on us as an organisation.
I gave evidence to the BASC on this, and I think there's no doubt that serious incidents are not being investigated well, and we see this all the time. And I think we are sharpening up our processes for looking at how well they are investigated at a local level. But as both Anna and Lewis have said, it is impossible, even for all the ones that end up with a severe harm or death, to be investigated by a national body. I think there are 10,000 of those a year, which will be 200 new investigations starting every week, which just isn't realistic. So I think one of the things that I was suggesting, and I still think is important, is that we need criteria for what should be done at a national level, what should be done at a local level but externally commissioned, so it's done by a completely different team. What should be done internally within a hospital but by a separate team from the one that where the incident was occurring, and what maybe some of the low harm or no harm ones can be investigated by the clinical team itself. I think if we could have clarity on that, and then about the appropriate methods for looking at it, we could then decide how many really do need to come to a national level, and what the criteria for those are. If we could agree that, then I think it would work well.
I think this debate was started by Camilla's point that this shouldn't get lost after the election, because the committee the past committee will change. Bernard Jenkins will presumably no longer be chairman. Well, we don't know. We don't know who will be chairing. We don't know who will be chairing him. So, can we keep this high up our own agenda here, so it isn't lost after the election?
I mean, I think it will undoubtedly be high up our agenda, because we are looking at the investigation of serious incidents all the time, and we will certainly keep it on the agenda, yes.
We have a meeting fixed up with Julie Mellor, actually, at the PHSO. Anyone would like to come to that meeting, they're very welcome to come. So I'll let you know when the date is, because, obviously the PHSO have a role in this as well. So that's happening in June. If you'd like to come, I'll let you know. Any other questions for David before we move on? Paul, I think you're introducing the next paper, please.
Thank you, David. And my colleague Emma Rourke, who's our Director of Intelligence, is joining for this session. So I'll make some points in summary and go through the two first sections of the paper, and then Emma will talk through the second half of the paper. I think the first thing to say is that we've, as part of the transformation that we've been undergoing at CQC, one of the big changes we've been trying to make is to make ourselves more information-driven, more data and intelligence-driven as a regulator. And we've made some significant changes and improvements over the course of the 2 years as a result, both in terms of the quality of data available to inspectors and also to the transparency with which that data is available to the general public, including through publishing intelligent monitoring in the acute sector, in mental health and in general practice. That's because we're committed to using data as part of our regulatory approach alongside site visits, alongside inspection. The second thing to say is that we are, just as with all elements of our regulation, we're continuing to learn and to improve, and importantly to be open about things when we haven't got them right, which is exactly what we see in the best general practices and best care homes and the best hospitals, and we want to take a leaf out of their book. So as the purpose of the paper highlights on the first page, what the paper is doing is covering GP, general practice intelligent monitoring, since the first publication in November of last year, and we'll focus the majority of what we talk about between Emma and myself on what we've learnt as a result of the full internal review and the internal audit that was commissioned since December in light of the errors that were found in the data that we published in November of 2014. The board's previously discussed those errors in public. There was a briefing also from Michael Meyer following last time's Regulatory Governance and Values Committee, where that committee looked at the results of the internal review and also the results of the internal audit and the process that we've undergone since December. The results of that internal review are that, to the best of our knowledge, there is no impact on our assessment of patient safety as a result of going through all the data and any changes that need to be made. There are no errors in any of the published data about the performance specifically of any practice. That's the numerators, denominators, or observed values that we see in each of the published GP intelligent monitoring reports. No new errors since the ones that were discovered in November time. But there are corrections that we do need to make in the way that we analyse the variation between practices. And we take that extremely seriously. We want everything to be completely right. That's at the heart of our learning and our improvement. And so we will publish a full technical note on all the changes that we want to make and explain those alongside republishing GP intelligent monitoring in the June. It had always been our intention to republish on an ongoing basis, just as we do in acute intelligent monitoring, for example, which is roughly every 5 months or so. Now, the vast majority of the corrections that we will make are small in scale. It means that it's about the movement in what we call the tail of the distribution. And this is because of the point about the analysis of variation. So what we have highlighted in intelligent monitoring is where practices are right at the ends of a distribution on individual indicators, individual 37 indicators that we look at. And what we've found is that we haven't got it right in all cases in the way that we deal with the tail. And Emma will go into more detail about that. But I wanted to make the point this is therefore about movements in the vast majority of cases that are really about the 10% of practices on a particular indicator who appear to be performing worse on that indicator. So we absolutely need to correct for those, and we will do so. But that's important to therefore say this won't impact on our judgments and on our ratings. Now, alongside that, we as we explore the way in which we analyse variation, we've had previous conversations at the in private board about the banding of general practices, the 1 to 6 banding structure that we applied in November 2014. And we've since that had conversations with general practice leaders, including the BMA and the Royal College of GPs. And they support our decision to remove bandings from GP intelligent monitoring, and also to remove language about risk specifically, so that we don't confuse or don't risk confusion with patient safety. The things that we are highlighting as being of significant variance from the average performance are not specific to the safety domain. They cover a lot of things on the GP patient survey, which is often about caring and responsiveness. They cover effectiveness, but they don't cover safety. And we want to be absolutely clear in the language we use that this is not about patient safety risk. So we won't be using the language of risk and elevated risk when we republish. That led to a letter to GPs following the discussion with GP leaders and following previous discussions with the board, explaining what we were going to do. And GP leaders were clear that they wanted to work with us as we continue to put data at the centre of our regulatory approach and how we best do that. So I think that's the overall summary. If I just take us briefly through the context on page 2 before handing over to Emma. Just a couple of points that I wanted to pull out on that section. Firstly is that we are, as we develop general practice intelligent monitoring, that's part of our overall approach to developing our knowledge and our information, as set out in our knowledge and information strategy, which went to the board, was endorsed by the board last year, and is the way in which we will improve the use of data to inform regulation. We're also, across all our sectors, looking to move from where we currently are in intelligent monitoring, and particularly the published data intelligent monitoring is on the quantitative data that is nationally comparable. And what we want to be able to do is give our inspectors the best possible information across the wide range of different available data sources. Some of that is nationally comparable, some of that isn't. It's either locally held quantitative data. It's quite often more qualitative data, including what patients tell us when we ask them, when comments are left, what GPs might say about practices they're aware of that they have concerns about, or other parts of the system have concerns about. There's a wealth of data available. Local health watches are another important source of that information, and we want to be able to bring all that together into a more comprehensive surveillance tool available to our inspectors, so that we can schedule our inspections most effectively, so we can identify the potential issues relating to the care of people using services and act on those quickly, and that we can inform the particular key lines of inquiry that we want to pursue on inspections and contributing to ratings assessments. And finally, just to highlight that Steve chaired the meeting of the external advisory group. That includes the GP leaders that I mentioned earlier, so that we have an ongoing forum to discuss and debate with them the best way to use and to present data in the general practice sector going forward. Emma.
Thank you. So if I begin my summary in the third section of the paper that you have seen, I don't propose to discuss in detail the errors that were identified back in November. They are well documented in the public domain, and we have apologised to those practices, the 60 that were affected. I'd like to begin in the first instance by looking at the response that we have conducted as a result of what was uncovered back in November. We came to the board in December, and the board gave us a very clear steer, as outlined in 3.4 in the paper, about the next steps that we would take, and that included an internal audit, that included an internal lessons learned exercise, a full review of our approach to intelligent monitoring, and a very clear steer to continue to build a stronger, more robust quality assurance framework that covered all of the work that the intelligence unit undertakes. So to begin with the intelligence quality assurance framework. Quality assurance has been undertaken across all of our products and services, our outputs across intelligence. one of the things that the internal audit identified was that there are pockets of good practice, but there is not a consistently high level of rigour applied to all of our products and services. So the quality assurance framework is intended to create, document and audit a gold standard that we can prove and provide assurance to ourselves and to others that mistakes that occurred back in November don't happen again. The document details the various stages of the quality assurance framework, beginning with a much more comprehensive planning stage, much more detail around what we would expect our analysts to undertake, clear responsibilities and accountabilities, providing analytical clearance, as well as clear accountability for an individual to pause or stop a product entering the public domain or reaching our inspectors if that process hasn't been appropriately followed. And what we call sort of customer sign-off or organisational sign-off, making sure that the product is approved, is fit for purpose by the individual that will be using that analysis. That we reach back to the success criteria that were set out at the beginning, and we are confident that not only is the analysis true, but that the analysis is undertaking the purpose for which it was done. Our internal audit that was undertaken earlier this year, as I said, did find example of good practice, and that did include our acute and mental health intelligent monitoring team that were determined to have substantial quality assurance processes in place. And we have ensured that learning is applied from teams and experts in that part of intelligence to colleagues who are developing newer products. The quality assurance framework also addresses the Macpherson recommendations. The Macpherson report was published after the collapse of the 2012 mainline disaster, the West Coast mainline disaster, because the underpinning analytical model, the risk model, wasn't sufficiently robust. And there's been a set of recommendations that we have incorporated. We incorporated some time ago for acute and intelligent monitoring, acute and mental health intelligent monitoring. But we do recognise the need to instil and embed that more broadly across all of our products, not just the risk models, which the recommendations primarily apply. Following the mistakes that came to light back in November, we undertook a lessons learned exercise. Just referring back to your previous discussion, it did consider human factors. It was facilitated by somebody outside of the intelligence unit. Work has been going on across all the areas to strengthen the team that are identified under 3.11. To strengthen the team, it is part of our broader strategy to professionalise CQC as a whole. The lessons learned and the discussions we've had as a subsequence of the internal audit have been discussed with NHS England, and that has started with a conversation between myself and the Chief Analyst of NHS England and has continued down throughout the various grades of those colleagues involved, both from our side as well as colleagues in NHS England. The activity that we've taken alongside the learning from the lessons learned exercise and the quality assurance framework, we consider to be live documents. They are intended to evolve and adapt as our systems and processes and our workforce evolve and adapt. It is not a static document, these recommendations that have come out of these events, but they are a series of activities that the leadership team, both in the intelligence unit and across Paul's directorate, are committed to continuing to review and embedding in the way that we continue our transformation. As a result of the activity that was undertaken following the November mistakes, Some further issues have come to light, which Paul mentioned at the beginning of this item. And I'll go through 4.2 in detail, just to clarify what we've found and why we have made particular changes. I would like to note that the issues haven't been raised by providers or members of the public. They've been raised by experts who have led as I said, a much more rigorous exercise and examination, not only of the data items, but the analytical techniques that we have applied to that data. So to begin with the Z-scoring, so we have two different methodologies that we can apply to data, which calculate the statistical significance of variation. One is additive, which is the one that we use more commonly. The other is multiplicative. We have identified that there are a number of indicators which use the multiplicative methodology, and it is our professional judgment that all of the indicators should be calculated using the additive method. As Paul said, this does affect the tail. It does affect the Z-scores, but importantly, those providers, those GP practices, which are in the bottom decile of performance, continue to be in the bottom decile of performance and are recognised by us as being so. We also uncovered an issue relating to low numbers, and this is specific to the GP patient survey indicators, of which there are 9. There are a number of different ways that you can treat low numbers. In this instance, again, it is our professional judgment that numbers less than 10 should be removed from assessment altogether, and that is the change that we have made. The suite of indicators relating to the presence of a register, these are categorical indicators. We have 3 indicators that relate to palliative care and learning disability registers being in place. What we have done is we have changed the way we treat the indicators to make sure that they are in line with other categorical indicators. Previously, under our language of risk and elevated risk, these categorical indicators, you could only achieve a risk score, not an elevated risk score. We feel that that is inconsistent with, as I said, with other similar indicators and an inappropriate use of the data. In reality, that only affects one of the 3 indicators because there is no variation in the other 2. And finally, the prescribing indicators. So we have 2 prescribing indicators. We have made an adjustment in the aggregation of the raw prescribing data. Our investigation identified that NHS England provided us with the prescribing data, which was not fully treated by them before they enter it into their primary care tool. And therefore, they didn't wholly match. We have made adjustments to the data and removed practices to ensure that there is alignment with what is appearing in the tool and what is appearing in our data for practices. Based on these changes, just over 1% of all practices, that's 91, do move out of being high priority for inspection. This is noting that intelligent monitoring is only one of the ways that we prioritise inspection. So as Paul mentioned earlier, following consideration of the evidence, we have removed banding and we have removed language relating to risk to avoid conflating our assessment with a risk to patient safety specifically. Part of the evidence that we considered was work that the engagement unit undertook in testing the value that bandings have to the public. And the feedback we have got is that the public go further into the detail, beyond the bandings that are published, and actually are very much more interested in the detail of individual indicators and how practices are relatively different to one another at a more granular level. So that assisted us greatly in making our decision and formed part of our proposal and our discussion that we discussed with GP leaders and the board. We will continue to risk stratify, but not as a summative band. We will continue as part of our development of GP intelligent monitoring to consider the right way that we can ensure that the data flows through to supporting our inspectors, making sure that our analysis has maximum impact as well as integrity. So in terms of our next steps, Paul has already highlighted many of those to you. To support the ongoing evolution of intelligent monitoring, the statistical evaluation continues. We discussed the first phase with the board last year of our acute intelligent monitoring evaluation. That continues to progress, and we have a plan to share with you that detail, and that will help us influence the future shape of all of our intelligent monitoring projects, not just GP intelligent monitoring. The quality assurance framework is an absolute priority for me and my team. I really want to emphasise the commitment to the quality assurance framework in everything that we do. This is alongside a range of initiatives that are being launched across intelligence, including our analyst competency framework that was launched this week. Again, part of our professionalising our workforce and what we do. The expert advisory group will continue to be a key body for us to engage with, and we are establishing a technical group that will get into the detail that will sit below that group, in addition to the leaders forum, which Steve Field chairs. So we will republish at the end of June a refresh of the intelligent monitoring, alongside the technical note that goes into full transparent detail of the technical changes that we have made. As part of the ongoing improvement of GP intelligent monitoring, we will make further changes through the year with a fuller refresh with what we anticipate to be additional changes, potentially new indicators, later in October. The full a second internal audit as a follow-up is part of our schedule going into this year. And we are also very keen to discuss with you the future of intelligent monitoring as a tool in regulation, and look forward to bringing a paper to discuss that in more detail and strategic context later on this year. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for that, Emma and Paul. Can I just ask a general question, just on GPs to start with? I mean, to what extent are we trying to sort of make a silk purse out of a pig's ear, in the sense that is there enough high-quality, reliable information to do the same job that we think we're doing on acute hospital, for example? I mean, are we really struggling to get enough information to make this whole exercise sort of robust enough?
So what we find is that each sector is different. The quality of the information in the acute sector is different and probably better when it comes to national comparable data than it is in the mental health sector. General practice is different again. As it stands, there are some good data sets. For example, the GP patient survey is a good data set. It's important. It's one of the best ways that we can assess what a large group of people using general practices feel about it, rather than talking solely, for example, to people in the waiting room on the day or days we inspect. The QOF data is also useful, prescribing data is also useful, but, and it's an important but, it's well acknowledged that the quality of general practice data isn't as good as we would like it to be, isn't as good as lots of people would like it to be. And one of the other things that Emma and I work on and lead in the system is developing the core data sets in different sectors, and that includes general practice, alongside colleagues in the other arm's length bodies. And really importantly, whether a lot of the power comes from is in being able to link different data sets together in a safe way that's respectful of people's confidentiality, of course. Doing so in that safe way really helps us to understand. But it's what the quality of care is. But most importantly, we're not asserting for a second that the quantitative data is the sole way in which we can get information prior to inspection. It's why it's so important, the relationships that Steve and his colleagues build up with the local clinical commissioning groups, for example, and all the other qualitative data we can all get hold of, which is what I was alluding to in the comprehensive surveillance. But no, I don't think it's without value at all.
Camilla, and Steve, you'd agree with that, would you?
I think Paul's absolutely right. One of the problems is the data on safety in general practice is very poor. So that's one area where we need to do more work nationally, not just us. The other problem that was encountered was that we and NHS England thought that every practice was producing the same data across the whole of England, but the QOF data varied dramatically. So, for example, in the Somerset area, they'd come out of QOF, and we couldn't band originally for there. But then we looked at places like Devon and other areas where NHS England thought that they were collecting the data at the same quality as elsewhere. They weren't. And so one of the things we need, which is outside our control, is that all practices should be collecting the same data, whatever that data is, so that you can compare practices in Somerset with Manchester, inner cities with rural. And so the total data set needs to be enhanced, but also the quality of collection needs to be improved.
I remain concerned that we are analysing GP practices and we are not able to analyse individual GPs, which I think is what the public would really like to see us do. And also that we're not, we've got a number of useful indicators. And I thought it was interesting, Emma, that you said, the public actually goes into the detail and, they're making decisions on that. But I think that's really interesting to know. But we're still not able to get at diagnosis, which is the thing, I think that the thing that is most important to the public is to know, is an individual doctor any good at diagnosing what's wrong with them? And to your point, David, it seems to me we're not there yet. And I suppose what I would, if we're going to do a wider review coming back to the board, in a few months, I would just like to understand: are we ever going to get to that point? And what do we need to help us get to that point? Because it seems to me that unless we can eventually get to that point, I think there is a question mark about what we're doing. And I think we're at a very early stage. And Steve quite rightly says, we're on a journey here. But I really would like now to understand what are the impediments to us assessing that stuff that I think is the most important to the people who, our clients,
So specifically, so I continue to practice as a GP. It's really difficult on data collection. So there are coding issues within practices. But if a patient comes to me or to another GP in the practice, they might see a number of GPs. That's the nature of practice. It isn't just a single GP often when you're collecting the data. So alongside collecting data, one of the things I've advocated, and Mike and I have spoken about this for years with his cancer hat on, is that the quality improvement and learning in the practice is really important. So any new diagnosis of cancer, for me, is a significant event, and you should start to look at why the patient presented in a particular way, whether it is in a timely manner, whether the patient was referred within the 2-week wait. And we're finding on inspections that sadly some GPs aren't referring consistently. We know that access varies dramatically between practices and between individual doctors. So it's actually quite complex. Whereas if you refer to a hospital, at least you've got a named consultant, even if they've been seen by the junior team at particular times. So it's that granularity which is very difficult. And also when you look at the prescribing data, there's initiation of prescribing within practices, but in larger practices, how you do the repeat prescriptions and even just following the evidence is very, very difficult, which is why the practice as a unit is probably the easiest way of looking at things at the moment. It's very, very difficult.
Can I ask just a little bit more about what this journey is that we're on to get better data? Because I do think that we've been handed a very difficult task, and so I'm fully behind you, Paul, in trying to make the best of available data. But there's this history in the NHS which is very powerful over the last couple of years about not putting a data burden on the system, and therefore accepting poor data. And those two things go together, and that's what it means. If we're not going to put a data burden on the system, we will continue to get the kind of data errors that you've had to deal with. And it's been a sort of caricature of proper data collection for years, which we are now struggling with, and to some extent being held accountable for. So instead of saying, here are the things that really matter to patients in the way that you might say, and therefore we don't want to have 160 indicators, as we have for hospital. If we had the right ones, we wouldn't need 160. These are the right indicators, and we want people to start collecting them properly. And yes, they may be more over time, but initially it might just be a small number of really crucial indicators. But instead of that, we don't say what are the right questions and now can we get the answers. We say what are the available answers, and therefore what should our questions be. And that caricature of proper data collection has run through the system in the NHS for years, and it's affecting. It is the root cause of what you're describing, really. I mean, it's a complicated story about what went wrong with individual indicators, but the root cause is that we have never really set out. We and the NHS has never really set out to ask the questions it really needs to know the answer to. By which I mean patients really need to know the answer to, which would be about things like waiting or access, or whether people get modern treatments. It would be outcomes for key conditions. And so on. There would be some key things that people want to know. So I do think that this process, is there a process? Is there a proper discussion which is likely to get us there? Because I've been sort of hanging around government departments for quite a few years, and I don't see a great deal of movement on this, actually. Every time you want to collect something new, there is a tremendously lengthy bureaucratic process in which the default position is there can't be anything new because it's too much of a burden. And just as a sort of extra, while that remains the case, we've got to do what you can do, but on the other hand, you've got to look at the other sources, and so the individual narratives become much more important. You made reference to Healthwatch and local Healthwatch people's stories. They become crucial because they may tell us the things that go wrong for individuals, may tell us things which rather sort of sporadic dips into the wrong data will never tell us, which is what people's experience is like.
Can I just add what? Sorry, Paul. Can I just add one thing which I don't want to dwell on, but because I think it just makes it even more complicated. But I think it is important to clock, which is that actually it's even worse than that in a way, Lewis, because we don't know what the public wants because no one's ever asked them what they would find helpful. So we all make assumptions about what seem to be sensible bits of information which the public would like to have. And then what we do is we offer those bits of information to the public and say, do you like these? And do you like the way they're presented? Or would you like something a bit different? And they give us some very interesting responses, which are an in-depth kind of review of what we've offered them. But that's not the same as asking people the question, when you're in the position of having to make a decision about using this service or using that service, or when your health is challenged for this reason or that reason, what information would you find it helpful to have, which is a completely different thing. So I don't think we know what the public would find helpful. So, not only are we using data sets which just happen to be there, we're then making assumptions about what people will find helpful when we go out and try and get new bits of data. So if we were going to do this properly, which is deeply, deeply challenging, you'd start by asking people what they want to know about, and add that to what we know then are the best indicators of whether or not those qualitative concerns are being delivered in the system, and then go out and find the data. Now, I mean, that's kind of nirvana, but it's not going to happen, is it? But I do think we need to have a bit of an eye on making sure that we're not just adding to what is an incredibly complex and very difficult information position from the public's point of view. More is not necessarily helpful. More can be deeply confusing, and kind of really focusing in on the bits of information which people truly need and can use and will help them to make good decisions. We're a long way from that too.
There's quite a few different points in that are being made. Let me see if I can go through some of them. I think particularly on the information for the public, Emma, you might want to comment on some of the work the National Information Board is doing. If I start with that, Anna, I won't be able to give a full answer. When we were thinking and we were constructing intelligent monitoring in the first place, I think the principles that we started with included transparency so that the public were able to see what we were doing to support the act of regulation. And I think, as you've described, that's a different perspective from the start. What do the public want to know about about general practice data or any other sector? We weren't attempting to solve that problem because it's so massive, and we did want to make progress and support our inspectors. So we started from the perspective that we needed to be transparent about what we were doing to support regulation, rather than the perspective about how do we make sure that all the information that's in the public domain is the information that the public most wants to see. But that's not to say that separate issue isn't extremely important, which is, I think, Emma will come in on. I think Lewis, to pick out a couple of your points, but I apologize if I missed these. On the journey, what I was alluding to there was a document that came out last year from all the arm's length bodies and is a statement of the current government's policy, the National Information Board's, I think, called Framework for Action, so where we want to get between now and 2020. It's quite a long document. It has a lot of things in it, and I think it's one of the things that we challenge is how we make sure that that stays prioritised. Because there's so many improvements that could be made in information, from the use of health apps to the use of data to support clinicians in making their judgments about care, through to the work that we're really talking about, which is what people describe as the secondary uses of data, whether it's data for research or it's data for commissioning or for regulation or the prevention of poor health. Specifically within that, I think there are 10 separate work streams in that document that it's trying to set out the journey for the system. There's one with the enlightening name of Workstream 2.2, which is specifically about how we can improve the use of data for regulators, commissioners, researchers, prevention and so forth. And that's jointly chaired by David and by Simon Stevens at NHS England. And where David isn't able to do that, I chair that, and Geraint Lewis does at NHS England. And there's an executive group that includes Emma as well as colleagues from other arm's length bodies. The purpose of that is to set out the roadmap for how we make better use of data, and we're going to split that into where we just need better data sets, as opposed to we've got the data sets but they may not be collected as appropriately as we would want them to be. The safety thermometer is potentially a useful data set. It is existing, but it isn't particularly comparable. And it's only collected, I believe, on one day of each month. There are improvements that could be made to individual data sets. And then, really importantly, the way in which we bring those data sets together, which I think touches on Camilla's point about how do you get, for example, into the diagnosis, the quality of diagnosis in a practice, or ideally within a GP. Well, if we solely look at GP data, that's extremely difficult, as Steve has highlighted. But if we combine safely and with patient confidentiality maintained, the records in the hospital environment, often very detailed records about the staging of the cancer, for example, and the treatment plan, and we look back historically at what the set of general practice interventions have been in their records, the more we can bring that all together, which is one of the things that care.data is trying to do, the better understanding we have of what the actual interventions are which help in general practice, also, of course, the interventions that help in the acute world and beyond. So that linking is a very important part of this work stream that we're supporting and leading. That's I think, the journey that we're on. I would say that one of the reasons I particularly like the linking argument is it's about linking existing data sets rather than introducing a burden. And I absolutely agree with you, Lewis, when you say there's often this question, how do you collect the right data? Because it's just we're told it's a burden. So I think we have to be live to that because frontline professionals need to do their jobs and not be tapping away at computers all day instead of providing frontline patient care, if that's the best way to provide frontline patient care. But wherever we can use the data that's already available and exploit it, that seems like the right thing to do. I would also say there are lots of ways to collect better data, and we need to get into that argument, that don't detract from providing patient care. And the best possible thing we can do is use the direct patient record or direct service user record in adult social care to inform all these secondary uses instead of a separate set of data collections, which is also part of that journey and part of the work stream. That's in Enlighteningly work stream 2.1. But then I think the second point you mentioned was about numbers of indicators, and I think that is also really important. There's separate work underway, and we will bring it to the board as it completes on the evaluation of whether, particularly on the hospital side, of those 160 or so indicators, which ones are most predictive, which ones are most powerful. But I think it's important that we also remember that even if there are particular indicators, a group of 10, 20 or 30, that are most likely to indicate the overall quality of care and a trust, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at least 160 and probably quite a lot more, because even if a mortality alert for sepsis in recent mothers following birth, that rarely triggers. It probably won't be the main determinant of a hospital's quality, but it's incredibly important that we do know it for the small number of hospitals that have a problem there so that we can follow it up. So I think we need to keep on our journey of using information in different ways. But part of that is isolating the data that's most important for the overall judgments we're looking to make. I don't know if that touches on all the points, but hopefully covers some of them. Emma, did you want to come in on the specific point about the work streams around public involvement in the use of data?
Yep, certainly. I mean, the framework for action has generated several work streams, both in looking at individual data flows, the systems to support those flows and the interoperability between systems. But one of the work streams specifically is looking at what members of the public would like to see and how various bodies across the system could respond to that. So NHS England is leading a lot of that with HSCIC to make sure that the infrastructure is there as well as the outputs are fit for purposes. So the evolution of NHS Choices, for example, will be a significant part of that, and we will also have a part to play in how the public would like to gain more information about our ratings.
At some stage in the summer, after the electorate has spoken, there'll be a meeting between yourself and the new Secretary of State. And I think some of this, if we could draw a real line between patient safety and the need for data, some of that is for that discussion. And where we're not just saying we like numbers, we'd like a load more numbers, but here are 2 or 3 major issues that actually we can't say the things that need to be said for the public. And that this needs the leadership at that level to try and unhook that. And that sort of debate with that sort of oomph, it's quite possible that a Secretary of State would want to do something with that.
Sorry, just one last point. I mean, I wonder if one of those issues might be what is the data that is being used for revalidation? I mean, if you have individual GPs in one part of the system supposedly going through some kind of MOT, which is judging their individual performance over here, and you have in another part of the system us sitting over here apparently unable to see that data or use it, that seems to me to be crazy. Partly because it doesn't help the public. I mean, I don't know whether it's any good, the revalidation data, you can tell me, but it doesn't help the public, but also it just adds to the paperwork going around to the system. And I mean, I really worry when I hear people talking about data burden as if it's some kind of theoretical thing. It's not. I mean, there's a new book by Dr. Martin Skur, very, very good book by a very experienced GP at the end of his career, you know, lamenting a lot of the changes that have happened, lamenting the fact that, you know, continuity of care is kind of disappearing and so on. He has a statistic in there. He says 40% of GPs' time is now being spent on paperwork or administration, partly because there are so many different points in which the system is asking them to sit down and write stuff into their computer. Well, I mean, you know, this is just nuts, right? I mean, if we're not adding value, we shouldn't be adding to the burden. So it just seems to me, back to Paul's point, I don't know if there are other examples of this, but that whatever data is being used for revalidation, we should be seeing. And if we're not able to see that, then I think the whole journey is in question.
But a big no, I understand the point you're making. No, in terms of what I was going to say. Sorry, Camilla, my communication skills need polishing. I wanted to just pick up on Lewis's point about hanging around central government. I've similarly hung around a bit as well, and my sense is National Information Board is actually doing something that I've not seen before. And I think Paul's and Emma's reference to the framework document and bringing people together, I think for the first time I'm seeing really hard and meaningful conversations which draw people together about these key issues. I think to Camilla's point, it strikes me that the issues around care.data and the electronic record are key issues. And so I think the framework is now the right people are coming together. Emma and myself met Andy Williams, who runs the Health and Social Care Information Centre, only on Monday. The National Information Board is up and running, is active doing this work. I think it's been clear about what work needs to be done. And my sense is people are acting together on this. I think the key challenge is priority. And I think to your point, Camilla, relevance, that I think there's a sense of it's scope what needs to be undertaken. I think the priority, I think there is, though, a need to state what the priorities are. I think there are some things that are more important than others. It's all important, but some things are urgent as well. And so I feel more confident that the right people are coming together for the right conversations than hitherto has been the case. The proof of the pudding will be, do they deliver? And I think it's why there's this need for urgency. So I just wanted to emphasise the points that both Paul and Emma are making about what has shifted. I think Tim Kelsey deserves a lot of credit for this, I have to say. He's made this happen, and it may well be that I was just suggesting to David that it may well be that the board wants to have a conversation with Tim and invite him either, you know, to a private session or a public session to have the conversation with it. This point about public data, Anna, national voices are a part of this and are making a contribution. I mean, Paul, you drew my attention to Vital Signs this week, which was a Richmond group speaking on behalf of those constituencies, saying these are the questions that we, to your point, that are important. This is what, as proxy members of the public, we're saying needs to be asked. And they do have some different data in that they think is important, including some of the mental health stuff as well. So, so I think there is a really important conversation taking place at the minute about how this can be drawn together. So I do have some confidence. The issue is going to be about speed and pace and priorities, I think. But I think for the first time, my point, David, is that for the first time, I think there is a mechanism that allows some of this stuff to come together. And, you know, it's an option to invite Tim to a conversation or a dinner or something.
Michael, did you want to add to this? I think there's an underlying frustration, in a sense, Emma, that we feel, I think most of us feel, that data is a critical part of what we do. and yet I think acute hospitals on putting them on one side. There isn't the data there that we can really say something really intelligent about. And maybe this is really where Paul is. I mean, if there is some information that you think is critical to making a judgment about GPs, for example, we should be asking for it. When the new government's in place.
So just for that, I think that's really important, and we can take that away as we're preparing ourselves for whatever happens after May the 7th. But I don't want to downplay how important what the quality is of some of the data we have in general practice. So when we look particularly at the mental health indicators, for example, and there's not these can never be a judgment on their own, absolutely. But we see, in comparison to some of the physical health indicators, where you might characterise broadly all GPs are in a pretty tight group in the way they handle physical health conditions. When we look at an indicator like, for example, the proportion of people with acute psychosis who have a record of their alcohol consumption in the last 12 months, which, as I understand it, it's collected for a reason, that one. That's an important determinant. We see an enormous spread in whether that data is recorded, whether the GPs know, from practices that are up in 90% or above of cases to practices that are well below half of the people that they're looking after with those really incredibly important conditions. They simply don't have that information. And that's a sort of thing that we can already use. One of the things that Steve and his colleagues do is they make the regulatory judgments. Is they don't just make a judgment at the level of the practice as a whole, but they make a judgment of the most important population groups. And one of those 6 groups is people living with a mental health condition. So I think we've got a long way to go, particularly on general practice data. We have a very long way to go, probably even further on our social care, and if Andrew would agree. And we have a fair old way to go, frankly, in hospital data. But I wouldn't want to imply that we don't have any good data to inform regulation now. We do, and we're trying to exploit it.
I guess I'd hope that we might be able to have quite a long discussion about this at the away day, because I think it is such a fundamental part of what we do. I mean, is July I mean, can you do something? I don't want you to do something if you're not going to have it ready by then. I mean, is July, can you do something by then?
We can bring a lot of information to the July session.
Yeah. Emma, thanks very much for your presentation. I mean, it's been very difficult for you, I know, and I think you haven't been defensive about this. You've been open about it, and that's really appreciated. I think we all take a lot of assurance from what you're doing. And I mean, if errors, mistakes get made, put your hand up quickly about it, because it's bound. We're all human. So thank you. Will you thank your team very much for the way they've responded to it as well? Thanks. Right. Next item is declaration of interest policy. I think this is for noting there is one small amendment to the staff declaration. Eileen.
There is. Thank you, David. Just by way of, first of all, I want to thank everybody who's made a contribution to this. It's been a very carefully and well thought through piece of work. Agreed. So thank you very much for that. There is, on the basis of human error that we just talked about, this paper has been through so many iterations that I think what has happened in pulling both staff and board declarations of interest policy together, there's been a page which has been inserted which came from an older version, which really on page 14 is a slight amendment. And I would say I spoke to Paul Roux as chair of the Audit and Corporate Governance Committee yesterday evening to just outline to him that error had occurred. He didn't feel that it was sufficiently material to hold the board back from ratifying. And of course we will make the amendment. It's to do with adult social care and the way in which adult social care, because of the volumes and the portfolios and the way that they are organised, plan to actually deal with declarations of interest, which is on the quarterly basis. So adult social care staff won't do a declaration at every inspection. They will do a quarterly declaration against their portfolio. And really what is missing from page 14 is something in parenthesis that says that. As I say, I did speak to Paul Roux about it, who owns the committee that has delegated board responsibility for this, and he was content. So I'm sort of putting it there with the apology.
No, I think we've, as the board, has discussed this many times, and perhaps we just record. Oh, Anna, sorry.
I'm really sorry, and but last time we talked about it, we agreed that we would take out the reference to Health Watch staff in the staff policy, and it's still in there.
Oh, okay.
So we'd be grateful if we could take it out.
Yeah.
We can do that.
Yeah.
Not a problem.
Okay, sorry. Good. Subject to that, everyone, can we ratify that? Thanks very much. And can we just thank everyone who's contributed, Paul Rue, who's not here as well. Thank you. Just before we come to questions from the floor, Michael, did you want to say anything about the RGVC that wasn't already covered when we discussed hospitals earlier? You sure?
No, I think we had a good discussion.
Okay.
And just... sorry, I think we had a good discussion earlier. I should just apologise that we effectively got a sort of a one-paragraph report on yesterday's meeting, but the meeting was yesterday, so I think what we'll do is for the next board meeting have a fuller report of yesterday's RGC meeting, because I do think it's important to have on record what was said and what was said and discussed at the committee meeting.
Well, maybe we can take that in conjunction with Mike's paper at the next meeting. Good, excellent. Any other business? Yes, we'll come to the floor. David.
Well, I hope you'll excuse me if I go back to the quality assurance framework, which I very much welcome the seriousness with which you dealt with these errors that you discovered. But it is a fact that these errors tended to be rather uncomplimentary to a group of GPs. And I would very much hope that you would take with equal seriousness evidence which tended to be complementary to any provider as well, because that is just as much in danger of being in error as evidence which works against them. I was looking back at the report which Paul Bate produced in November, which was an excellent report, but it was all about what you do with the intelligence that you already have, how you publish it and how you disseminate it to your staff. And I was a bit disappointed because it didn't really address the problem which David Pryor raised earlier of is there enough, and I'm particularly meaning, is there enough qualitative intelligence? So I wonder if the reason why there isn't, one of the reasons why there isn't, is because of the kind of evidence that you use. And I'm particularly thinking, you say that most providers come out well on the caring for caring, though they don't for safety. And I wonder if that isn't partly because there seems to be, and I've been sort of looking at the CQC for quite a long time, since 2012, a reluctance to use objective, hard-nosed evidence. And that was why I was going on such a long time about cameras, but cameras are only a small part of it. There's also the question of putting in covered staff. And there are many ways in which you could. You seem to concentrate to a great degree on looking in the files. And I was rather struck looking at the website when you were advertising for inspectors that the job seemed to be just looking at the files and seeing the reports. But it is obviously so much more than that. And the other thing you do is talking to people, but there you have all the dangers, all the problems that you have with whistleblowers, of people being frightened to talk, or else if the care has finished by that time, then there is the possibility that they don't really remember who gave the care or what the care was like. And I wonder if you are having an away day, whether it would be possible for you to think a little bit more about the kind of evidence that you are using right across the 3 directorates, because at the end of the day, what the public does want is that the CQC should know what is happening. And we don't want things like the old deanery where you give them 5 green ticks and then you find that they are very, very far from caring. So that's the end of it.
David, thank you. But I think, you know, what you say is very valid. I don't think there's a perfect inspection system or a perfect intelligent monitoring system, but we can make it what we've got better all the time, and listening to people, users, carers, relatives is absolutely critical to that. So thank you for that. Bren, did you want to say something?
Yeah, David, after discussing it with you before I say it, whatever, really, but the long and the short of it is I'm really keen when you do your reports what, you know, families and people actually feel about those reports and whether or not they relate to it as well, really. And I just want to bring one example, really, of how someone shared something with me about a report that was done in a care home in England. And they read a letter, funny enough, that had come from the care home to the families on the CQC inspection, a summary of it, really. And they said, you know what? That reads absolutely right to how we feel as a family and whatever, and our family in there, really. There are areas about it that in terms of caring was good, but one of the areas was really poor on well led. And what they could do is they could tell you root and branch about why it wasn't very well led as well, really. And I'll probably have a chat with Andrew a little bit after the meeting or whatever, really. I think what that really showed to me is you've got your own internal assurances, haven't you? You've got those and whatever, really. But again, if we're outward looking, you know, here's a family who's got a loved one in there, and they read what comes from the care home as a summary from the CQC, and they say, absolutely spot on, absolutely spot on in all those areas. I suppose the one area that they pointed out was slightly disappointing, really, was the fact that there was an inference in the letter that the CQ had inspected on a difficult day or an awkward day. I can't remember the wording for it and whatever, really. And I think that said to the family and whatever, really, well, you know, we don't care what day it is, but more important, we care exactly if the inspection tells us how it is for our loved ones, really. So I suppose what I really want to say is that, you know, again, as I said before, be very proud of yourselves for what you're doing, because this is being picked up by people who read that and absolutely relate to it. And that is an external quality assurance, but for me, hugely powerful.
Thank you very much for that, Bren. That's very encouraging feedback. Thank you. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask, or you sure?
We don't have any particular questions now, but we would like to know if there is a possibility to talk to some of you afterwards in a private way for a few more general questions. Because we are Belgian students and we are not fully familiar with what is exactly happening right here. So I don't think our questions are relevant to at the moment.
Coffee now. Do you want to have chat to us over coffee during our break?
That would be wonderful.
That would be fine.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Good. Right. Thanks very much. Thank you.